This week in digital photography, we're going to be taking a look at using artificial light in your photography. Artificial light can come in a variety of forms, so we're going to talk about just what is artificial versus ambient light and how can we change the quantity, the quality, and the direction of that light. Ambient light is any light that the photographer did not bring to the shoot. It's also known as available light, and it's any light that you haven't set up yourself. This includes any natural light or even pre-existing lighting that's built in and around the location that you're shooting. So it could be an open window, but it could also include a table lamp, a chandelier, a spotlight, a candle. Ambient just means that it's a light source that you didn't bring into the scene, but will still contribute to the final exposure. Artificial light, on the other hand, is light that we as photographers are going to put in place specifically for the purpose of our photos. It could be a flash unit, it could be a big studio strobe, it could be what we refer to as continuous light, like one of these LED light panels. Artificial light, from a photographer's perspective, generally doesn't include things like lamps or candles unless those things are moved into new position just to be able to light the scene in a specific way. That said, all sources of light that will impact your scene must be accounted for when you're setting up your camera. You may need to account for a mix of ambient and artificial light in your images. So, light. We often say that light is light, and while that's true to a degree, the reality is that light can vary greatly in many ways. The light from a campfire is very different than the light from a studio strobe. A flashlight is very different from a fluorescent tube. And being a photographer requires us to be fluent in speaking the language of light. We need ways to describe light and understand the differences between light sources. So light can be very flat or it can be very harsh. Flat light limits or eliminates shadows, while harsh light will give deep, dark shadows. Light can be balanced and light can be really dramatic. Light can be in short supply or very abundant. Light can also be warm or cool. And this is really important. The color of light can very precisely be documented, and in photography speak, we refer to this as white balance. The color of light is actually measured on the Kelvin scale, which objectively measures the temperature or the color of the light. Have you ever noticed that pictures taken near a campfire can leave everyone looking very orange? That deep orange light lies at the bottom end of the Kelvin scale, around 1,000 degrees. On the other end of the spectrum, maybe you've seen photos of hikers on top of a big mountain, and they might look really, really blue, closer to 10,000 degrees Kelvin. And yes, lower temperatures are warmer, which is counterintuitive, but that's just the way it works. If you look in your camera, you might see a button or a setting where you can adjust your white balance setting. Most cameras have a variety of settings like those on the right here, where you can tell the camera what kind of light you're in, and the camera will account for that light to kind of normalize it to our eye. See, our eyes, when we're in those situations, automatically adjust and accommodate for different colors of light. But the camera records the image without the benefit of the human mind to adjust the colors of the light. The camera does have an auto white balance setting where it will guess about the color of your light, but it may not always do a great job. So these preset white balance settings can be really important, especially if you're shooting in JPEG mode. In JPEG mode, you can't readily adjust your white balance after you shoot an image. If you're shooting in RAW, you can always go back and adjust your white balance afterwards. I always tend to shoot in RAW, so I generally rely on auto white balance, and I can go ahead and make those changes afterwards. Many cameras will also let you dial in very specific white balance settings using Kelvin temperatures. As an example, when I went on my honeymoon, we went to the Grand Tetons, and my images were coming out super blue. At that elevation, the light was closer to 8,500 degrees Kelvin. The preset icons only let me go up to 7,000 degrees for shady, but I was able to use the user-defined setting and dial in the Kelvin scale. Now, I didn't know what the right setting was, but I guessed it was around 8,000. I shot a few images, and then I looked at the LCD on the back of my camera. They still looked a little bit cool, so I bumped it up to 8,500 degrees. Was it 1,000% perfect? Probably not, but it was close. So all of that, and the bottom line is that sometimes when you're shooting, the light just isn't naturally conducive to good images. You have a choice. You can either walk away and take no pictures, or you can take pictures that aren't very good, or you can modify the light in some way to make it work for you. But it is work. It's not simply going to happen all by itself. There are lots of reasons that we might use artificial light, and we've already covered a lot of these. Now we can dive into the steps that we might take to be able to modify that light. For starters, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page with some of the basic terms that you may hear when we're talking about artificial light. TTL, or through the lens, allows the camera to determine the flash output. Typically, your built-in flash on your camera will use TTL technology, and you can simply pop up the flash and expect the camera to make lots of decisions and get a reasonably good exposure on the subject. But you are letting the camera make some guesses on your behalf. With manual flash, you are setting the flash output in fractions of the full power of the flash. Typically, if you're shooting in a studio setting, you'll probably want to use manual flash, where you can manually adjust the output of each light to create specific effects. It's much more predictable and allows the photographer to really craft the light exactly as they want it. Sync speed is the fastest shutter speed at which the shutter is completely open at any one time. It's typically between 1/60th and 1/250th of a second. Okay, so this one is only important for flash photography, and it's kind of hard to imagine, but in a nutshell, when you push the button on your camera, there's a curtain inside the camera that slides open in front of the sensor that's going to expose the sensor to light. And then a fraction of a second later, a second curtain slides across the window to block any more light from hitting the sensor. The sync speed is the fastest shutter speed at which the entire sensor can be exposed at the same time. At speeds that are faster than that, the second curtain will actually start to close before the first curtain is fully open. And as a result, if the flash were to go off during that exposure, only the section of the image that wasn't obscured by the curtains would get full exposure, and the sides of the image would remain dark. High-speed sync is a setting that's available on certain cameras when paired with certain flashes that will allow you to get proper exposure at even faster shutter speeds. And the way it works is that your flash will actually fire multiple times within the course of that exposure. So say you're shooting at 1/1000th of a second. The flash might actually fire 2 or 3, 4 times within that same 1/1000th of a second. Now the flash is so fast, so short that your human eye won't be able to perceive the multiple flashes. But each time the flash fires, it'll lighten up the exposed portion of the image at that moment. And finally, triggers. Triggers are devices that we attach to our camera and to our flash that allow the camera and the flash to communicate without being in physical contact. That's what allows us to set up flashes on light stands and move them around within the scene. It's time for a little bit of math class. Now, don't panic. You don't need to get super deep into the weeds here. But the basic premise of the inverse square law is really simple and really important. Bear with me here. Basically, the inverse square law says that the intensity of illumination changes in inverse proportion to the square of the distance from the source. To help illustrate this point, check out this flash head here. An object that is 1 foot from the light will receive a certain amount of light, and something that is 2 feet away will receive 1/4 as much light. Why 1/4? Because 2 squared is 4, and when we take the inverse of 4, it becomes 1/4. Likewise, something that is 3 feet away would receive 1/9 as much light because 3 squared is 9. You can see that by the time you are 4 feet away, you're getting 1/16 as much light, and then 1/25 as much, and then 1/36 as much, and so on. All of this just goes to show that if you want to light up a subject that is more than a few feet away, you're going to need a really bright light source. And it goes without saying that if you're trying to light up multiple subjects in the same scene with one light, the object closer to that light is going to get much more light. All right, enough with math class. Let's look at ways we can add sufficient light to a scene to get some reasonable exposure. If we're shooting in a relatively dark place, we're going to need to add light, and we can do that in a few different ways. If there is already an existing light source with some sense of directionality to it, we could add in a reflector to bounce light back into the subject. Reflectors are great because they're super cheap, and you can make one for yourself really easy. Simply grabbing a sheet of white foam core works. And if you need to bounce even more light, you can crumple up some aluminum foil and glue it to one side of the foam core and use it almost like a mirror to shine light back onto your subject. You can also use a constant light source like that LED panel or even a regular shop light. These continuous light sources are good because you can see exactly what effect they're going to have on the image before you take the picture. If it's too bright, you can pull it further away. If it's not bright enough, bring it in a little closer. If you see dark shadows, put a white fabric in front of the light to soften up the shadows, and so on. When I first started trying to play with still life photography, I went to the hardware store and I bought one of these clip lights that's really not much more than an electric cord, socket, an aluminum shield, and basically a set of tongs that you can use to attach it to something to hold it in place. Back in the day, they were, I don't know, $3, $5 a piece. Today they might be up to $10, but they're easy to find at your local hardware store and relatively inexpensive to get going. Another option you could use is the flash that's built into your camera. Whether you're shooting a cell phone or a DSLR, you probably have some sort of a built-in flash. These are super convenient, but there are a couple of drawbacks to using them. Number one, they're really low powered. Generally, the light from one of these pop-up flashes is good for up to 6 feet, maybe 10 feet at most. And number two, because they are built into your camera, you can't move them away from your camera to get any sort of light other than flat light. But in a pinch, they do work in some situations. A step up from that would be a secondary flash unit that mounts to the top of your camera. On top of any DSLR camera is a bracket that will accept a flash, and that bracket is typically referred to as a hot shoe because it contains electrical contact that will allow the flash and the camera to talk to one another. The big advantage here is that these flashes are much more powerful and throw light much farther. They also usually have a flash head that can be angled upwards towards the ceiling or a swivel left and right towards a wall so that you can bounce light towards your subject and avoid the really harsh shadows. If you are planning to purchase such a flash, beware that you buy a flash that is compatible with your camera. Nikon flashes can't be used with a Canon camera, for example. There are third-party companies that build flashes for all the major camera brands, and you can definitely buy one of those for a lot less money. Just be sure that it's made to fit your camera. Neewer is a popular company that makes powerful flashes at very low cost. Of course, with any of these sort of Amazon knockoff products, the quality may not be great, but they can be cheap. They might be even so cheap that you can almost treat them as disposable, so long as you don't do shoots where flash is absolutely critical, like shooting a wedding. For comparison, my Nikon flash cost me about $300, but the comparable Neewer flash might be somewhere around. And finally, the most versatile but also the most expensive option is to use some sort of off-camera flash. This can simply be the flash that you mounted on the hot shoe of your camera, or it can be a big dedicated studio strobe. To use these off-camera flashes, you'll need some sort of a trigger and generally a light stand plus some sort of a modifier to soften the light. When you're using the same flash you mounted on your camera, you can often get away with buying a stand, a white photo umbrella, and an umbrella bracket for about $50 total, and then buy a pair of triggers for maybe another $100. Using your flash off camera allows you to use a bunch of different modifiers. Even if you're using a regular external flash, you can often use it with different modifiers. Here we see some of the options available for external flashes. In number one, we see your typical umbrella attached to an umbrella bracket and mounted on a light stand. In number two, we see a small fabric box mounted to the flash. This is typically known as a softbox, and softboxes are a staple in studio photography. In studio, however, you'll often see these very large softboxes, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, or even larger. If it's mounted directly on your camera, though, the softbox options are going to be much smaller for portability. In number 3, we see color gels, or colored sheets of plastic that can attach to the flash to give it a bright, bold color. Number 4 shows a modifier called a flash bender, and it's simply a white reflective fabric that's mounted into some sort of a wire frame so that you can bend it into different shapes and throw the light just where you want it. But because it's reflected off of a much larger base, it's softer and more diffused than direct flash. In number 5 is another diffuser, this one made by the company Gary Fong, and it's called the Fong Dome. It's essentially the same thing as a softbox, but it's made of solid, translucent plastic with grooves that help to disperse the light. And finally, number 6 is an entire system known as the mag mod, or the magnetic modifier. With this system, you simply attach the black ring here to the flash head of your camera, and then you can pick a variety of just different modifiers like the color gels, the bounce card, the equivalent of the Fong Dome, or this is what they refer to as a grid. Each of these different modifiers has a different effect on the final output of your light. If you move up into using a big studio strobe, there are many of the same options, but they tend to be much larger and much more powerful. Instead of a 24-inch umbrella, in number 1 we'll see a 7-foot reflective umbrella. In number 2 we see a softbox that is somewhere around 20 inches by 30 inches as compared to the 3x4-inch softbox we saw on the last slide. We see the same color gels in number 3, but a little larger. Number 4 shows a device known as a snoot, which basically focuses the light into a smaller area and shields everything else from getting any light. This is really helpful when you're needing precise placement of accent lights. Number 5 shows a grid, which can clip onto the front of your strobe and have basically the same effect as a snoot. And finally, number 6 shows a beauty dish, which is a really specialized type of reflector that bounces the light off of the smaller white plate in the middle and bounces it back out into the bigger white dish on the outside. The beauty dish is really common in high-end makeup shoots. The look from the beauty dish is really similar to what you see in the ring lights from YouTubers and such like that. Okay, so let's look at some other ways that we can use artificial light in addition to trying to capture images just in low light situations. Sometimes we find ourselves shooting in direct sunlight where there might be plenty of light for the scene, but there are also some really dark shadows, and we might need to add some light to fill in those shadows. Other times we might find ourselves shooting where there really is flat light, and we might want to add light from one direction to give ourselves a little bit of punch to the image. Often having more light on one side of the image than, more light on one side of the subject than on the other helps to add shape and dimension to our subject. In this example, the image on the left was shot without any flash, and you can see there's giant dark shadows on the left side of the figurine. The right side looks okay, but the left side is so dark that we really can't see much detail. In the image on the left, I added a flash to the right side, to the left side of the image to be able to fill in those shadows. Truth be told, I probably would have been better off to use a reflector card to kick just a little bit of light in. The flash was really too strong for this image, but it's okay. Flash is also great for stopping fast action. If you're shooting quickly moving subject like butterflies, or maybe your cat chasing the laser pointer on the carpet, using a flash will allow you to use much faster shutter speeds. In some instances, you can use a very short burst of the flash, which is something like 1/100,000th of a second, as the sole source of light and literally stop the motion of a super fast object. This one is pretty cool, but it can also be a little more complicated. We can actually use the inverse square law to be able to darken the background so that they become less of a distraction. You've probably all seen an image where someone takes a picture of a friend outside at night using the flash. The person might look well exposed, but the background is pitch black. That's because the flash, no matter how big, isn't going to light the entire field behind the subject. Let's say you're taking a photo of your friend and you place them 3 feet in front of a brick wall. and then you stand 3 feet in front of the person to take their picture. If you set your exposure to get the subject well lit, the background will be twice as far away. Using what we know from the inverse square law, that means the background will be 1 over 2 squared, or 1/4 as much light as the subject. So essentially your background will be about 2 stops darker than your subject. If we want to make that example even more extreme, we can simply move ourselves closer to the subject. If we were to move to just 1 foot away from the subject, but the subject is still 3 feet from the wall, our settings would give accurate exposure to the subject, and the wall would now be 4 feet away, which is 4 times further than the subject is. Using the inverse square law, that background would end up being 1/16 as bright as the subject, or 4 stops darker than the subject, even though the subject and the wall never moved. Now let's take just one last run down the rabbit hole here. Anytime that we're using artificial light to illuminate our subject, we have the opportunity to balance the ambient light with the artificial light. So let's see what this actually looks like. This image on the left, I just shot the image as the scene indicated with no flash. On the right, I added a flash to the left side of the image. You can see that my left side is a little bit lighter than my right side. I dialed my flash back down to about half power so that it didn't make my left side super bright. I want you to look at the background though. Remember, my little flash unit isn't going to impact the exposure all the way in the back where we see all those trees and whatnot. That's pretty cool and all, but what if I wanted to darken down the exposure of the trees? Here's a sample of the same setup, but this time I changed my aperture from f5.6 to f8 and kept the same shutter speed, giving me a darker scene overall. It's a little underexposed. Everything got about 1 stop darker, including my subject. So to compensate, I bumped up the flash power to full power, 1 stop more powerful than the half power we used in the last slide. That extra light isn't going to be reaching the background. I then created the image on the right where the background is still fairly dark, but my subject is properly exposed. Here's a quick before and after that shows the impact of using a flash and actually balancing the ambient and the flash exposures together. The image on the left, the before, has a very snapshot sort of feel, kind of a quick, easy grab shot without really paying much attention. The image on the right looks a little bit sharper, a little bit clearer, and has a more professional feel to the overall image. So is your head spinning? This was a long lesson, and there's a lot of material covered, and a lot of it was based on gear and equipment that you don't have yet. The good news is I'm not going to be asking anyone here to be shooting big studio portrait work with all the complexities of light meters and modifiers and expensive studio gear and all that. But I still think it's important to expose you to a variety of photographic techniques. And a course that just doesn't address artificial light at all, well, it's not really giving you the full picture of photography, so to speak. Reality is, you can accomplish many of the same effects simply by being aware of the natural light and using simple things like reflector boards, table lamps, and any other source of light that you have available to create strong images. When we look at shooting still life images, which is going to be part of your third portfolio, you'll want to be keenly aware of these techniques and put them to work even in the small scale if you're photographing a still life on a windowsill with a reflector board and maybe a window curtain as a backdrop. A strong image is a strong image, even if a behind-the-scenes look doesn't seem super technical. I hope this presentation has opened up your eyes just a little bit to how important it is to be able to work with both artificial and ambient light when you're behind the camera.